Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack, and I'm very, very excited to say that my guest today is my dad, Phil Fernjack. We're going to talk about Beatlemania and actual science behind things such as why were people fainting and crying and screaming, and how do the Beatles actually affect people physically with their music? In addition to just kind of the emotional grit of the band members themselves. I mean, they were teenagers when they first started. So, for more information and to watch other podcasts as well, please feel free to touch base with my YouTube channel, which is also called Emotional Grit, and feel free to like and subscribe. So, we'll go ahead and get started. But, Dad, thank you for being here today. I appreciate it.
Sure, an easy subject to talk about, so I'm happy to be here.
You got that right. So please take the listeners back to February of 1964. At that time, it had just been a matter of months since JFK had been assassinated. MLK had given his I Have a Dream speech. The Vietnam War was taking place. There were a lot of things that were going on in the country at that time, and people were craving something just kind of lighthearted and something they could actually just have more positive associations with. So I'm wondering, with the Ed Sullivan Show, what do you remember as far as how you heard about the fact that he was going to be having the Beatles on the show on a certain episode, and what was it like to watch it?
Well, their first songs came from England, and we didn't have internet back then, so we could easily connect with people over there. But Love Me Do, their first song came out, which was kind of a slow-paced song. It didn't set the world on fire. And but we heard them among other artists. We were slowly moving from the rock and roll early days of Elvis and Ricky Nelson and those folks from the 50s. And the Beatles started to represent something new for a lot of different reasons. Many of them you've already mentioned. But the way they sang and the songs they sang, the words meant an awful lot to a young generation. So I was happy to be part of it. It was talked about in school. We saw in the evening news that this band was landing in New York and they were going to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I remember watching in my living room. I was the oldest of 5 children. And my mother, being from England, I guess made it a little bit more attractive for me too. She was anxious to see them herself. My dad was fine. He didn't say anything either way, pro or con, but it certainly lit the teenage world on fire.
Oh, definitely. I know that if you think about it, maybe about 7 or 8 years before that, most people in the US didn't even own a television set. So for you to actually be able to watch the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, not just hear them on the radio, but actually see them as they're singing, and here they are, these artists from a different country, was a really, really big deal. And the episode that they were in was in black and white because the Ed Sullivan Show didn't get color until the following week. So like other TV shows of its time, it was all done in black and white. But just the novelty of the act, carried a lot of weight. And that's one thing that I shared in my book about the Beatles, about how the actual science of novelty, when you have something new like that that catches people's attention, it really can affect you physically. If that's your kind of music, especially as far as making you feel good and kind of getting that rush of those feel good chemicals of the brain. I know that when I saw some footage of whether it was girls at the Ed Sullivan Show or girls in different stadium settings during Beatlemania, the screams were so loud that it's my understanding the Beatles couldn't even hear themselves play. Is that your understanding as well, as far as like just people having this visceral response?
Well, my cousins that I met several years later, who were my age over in England, they would tell me they were in the crowd. They were the girls screaming. The band had lit the popularity on fire over there in England, and their concerts were packed. And they weren't showmans in the way of dance routines and fancy footwork. It was just their melodies, their music, their rock and roll blues kind of sound. And I recall that after the Ed Sullivan Show, and maybe a few months later, that next spring, there was the first Beatles movie, I believe it was Help, that came out in Duluth. And 4 or 5 of us guys, and that's an interesting thing too. It wasn't just a girls thing that were screaming. The guys were attracted to their music too. And we packed into the car and went to Duluth. It was so exciting. In a theater full of teenagers where everybody was happy. And I think, as you mentioned, I think the stress of the assassinations of several dignitaries and the war in Vietnam, there was so much stress on society They were looking for some way to release it. And the Beatles certainly timed it just right and fit that notch. That the movie theater was just wild, kids screaming, and it was just a silly movie anyway. But the music was fantastic, and we all left with just happy feeling in our hearts.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just for context for the listeners today, cable TV did not exist yet. There were no 24-hour TV channels. As a matter of fact, different cities only had a limited amount of TV stations. I think back to when I grew up in northern Minnesota, same town as you, Cloquet, kind of by Lake Superior, where at the time we only had 3 TV stations. It was CBS, NBC, and ABC. Well, I guess PBS was in there too to watch Sesame Street. But there was no Fox, no Fox TV. It hadn't been invented yet. But even when it was invented, people in Minneapolis had access to it. So I remember when people would come up to go to college with me up in Duluth, they would talk about this TV show called Beverly Hills 90210. And I was like, Beverly Hills what? Because we didn't have that TV channel or that TV show where I lived. So things were just so limiting. And I know that with different kinds of music as well. If you think about it, when the Beatles, when their music first became popular and the whole idea of rock and roll was in its infancy, a lot of different types of music that we're aware of today didn't even exist yet. I mean, there was no hip hop, rap, hair bands, punk, new wave, grunge, all that kind of stuff didn't even exist. So these guys, the novelty of the Beatles and that whole genre was just something where if you could actually see them or go to one of their movies, you couldn't just rent the movie and watch it later in a VCR or streaming. Those things didn't even exist yet. So for you to go to that theater, either you went there when the movie was there or you missed it and now it was gone. So that's pretty amazing to think about. But in terms of the actual neuroscience, which ties in with my book about why people were screaming and fainting and crying and all that jazz, it actually has to do with our involuntary nervous system. So I did some research on this. And with our involuntary nervous system, there's 2 different kinds. There's fight or flight, and then there's one called rest and digest. And as far as fight or flight, when you have kind of a sudden, strong emotion, whether it's fear or even happiness or a sense of relief, it can actually affect your tear ducts. Like you can cry either tears of fear or tears of joy. That's why, like, if you see videos on YouTube of people who are in the military and they surprise their loved one by coming back to the US and maybe surprising them at school or something like that, people will start crying when they see them. It's that sudden emotion that hits you. Well, the same thing happened with the Beatles, where you'd have people just crying in the audience. And then again, as part of that fight or flight response system, it can affect your heart rate. And so you would have people who would be passing out. And from what I read, there would be actual nurses on site at concerts with smelling salts for people who would pass out just because of the effect the Beatles would have on them. So it's pretty amazing to think about. But I know when you and I spoke a little bit in anticipation of this interview, you mentioned how Beatles music affected soldiers when you were serving in Vietnam. Could you tell people a little bit about that?
I think, and I'm not a psychologist, but it seems like there's almost a predictable pattern where societies tend to look for something different. And as you mentioned, you go from Elvis Presley, Ricky Nelson, etc., Frank Sinatra previous to that, and all the great sounds, big band sounds. Then you go into the Beatles area and other European bands that came to America, as well as the Beach Boys and things like that. And then it moved into what? I can't name them all, heavy metal. And then it moved into what were the Bee Gees part of the...
disco.
The disco music and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The Beatles really weren't known so much for dance music. Like, I don't think they ever appeared on American Bandstand, which was very popular in its day, where kids look for something I can dance to. The Beatles songs were something I can relate to. The words were, we felt clear, the emotions of falling in love and having a crush on a girl and the breakup and all that kind of stuff. So all the emotions of being a young person. And it didn't bother, I don't think, anybody that went to a concert, which, by the way, were only about a half hour long. They weren't like Taylor Swift is now, where she's got a 2.5-hour show. It was get on stage, sing about 10 songs and get off. And one of the reasons why they quit performing was because the fans were screaming so much and causing so much commotion. They couldn't even hear themselves play the music. So they felt their music was not being appreciated live. So they then said, that's it. No more touring. I remember Paul saying it, I think it was in California, they were like throwing into the back of a truck like a meat locker. and they didn't feel like their music was being appreciated at live concerts. So they dedicated themselves to making albums. And we would look forward to it, the next album coming out, and who got the first one from Len's Melody Music Shop or someplace in Duluth where you could get an album for $3.95, And everybody's excited about it for about a 5-6 year run that they had.
So did you use like babysitting money, or was it something where you at that time had a part-time job, or how did you have like save up to go buy a record? I bet it was probably a big deal to go buy one.
Well, back in those days, they had what were called record clubs, and you would pay so much. I think it was a month. You'd pay a few dollars a month, and then you would get to select from the latest albums that would come out. So they made it easier for kids to get albums. But no, yeah, babysitting or baling hay or cutting grass, maybe doing some odd jobs for people so that you could get the $3.95 to buy the album. Yeah. And then you'd play them over and over in the old phonograph with probably dirty needles, and you'd practically wear the record out.
Well, and I was going to say, from what I remember when I was little, I think it was you. Didn't you play a Beatles record or certain songs on it to a point where it turned kind of white?
Right. It would loop around so many times, you'd listen to them almost daily. And it was just a feel-good thing. It wasn't just you and the Beatles. You felt like you belonged to something bigger than that. Mm-hmm. You belonged to, even if you weren't directly involved with the fan club, it was something you talked about with your friends. Have you heard the latest song from the Beatles? Do you know what later on they got a little more deep in their meanings? Did you figure that song out, what it really meant, especially Sgt. Pepper's when it came out?
A little Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds?
Lucy in the Sky, or yeah. Strawberry Fields, or
mm-hmm.
Yellow Submarine.
Yes. That's a good song.
Right.
But so circling back to when I was growing up and when I was, going to junior high and high school, the whole genre of rap and hip hop exploded. And I mean, and it had been around maybe since like the late 70s. So fast forward 10 years, but it was still new. I mean, at that time in Duluth, which just for listeners who aren't from Minnesota, that's on the shores of Lake Superior up in northern Minnesota. But, there were no radio stations I was aware of that were playing that kind of music, So in order to actually hear this new kind of music called rap, like I liked this group called Run DMC. They were new back then. They were from New York. But you had to be lucky enough to know someone who would have their music on a tape or a record and then go listen to it somewhere because you couldn't hear it on the radio. And I remember maybe, 10 years ago, I was in Beverly Hills for work, and I was driving back to LAX to go catch a flight. And I happened to drive by a sign for this city called El Segundo. And I was like, oh my gosh, El Segundo is a real city. Well, I didn't know that one of the rappers when I was in high school, his name was Q-Tip. I'm sure you're like, Q what? But his name was Q-Tip. He rapped about a city called El Segundo that I didn't know was a real place, because back then there was no World Wide Web. You couldn't just Google things. There were no radio stations playing certain music, so you just didn't know. I looked at it more as like lyrics to a play, or like something that was like make-believe. I just didn't know it was real. So a whole new world was opened up to me by music in that regard. And for you, back in the 60s, to get exposure to this music from Europe, whether it was the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or other groups as well, was just something totally new, So I'm just curious as to, with your fan club kind of stuff, were there other things that went beyond the movies? Like, did you guys go to dances and listen to the music at school or play with people's houses or anything?
Well, like I said, I would say at one point they had like 4 or 5 of the top 10 songs on the chart, the top 40 chart. And on the hour, you would hear a Beatles song. Kids would call in the local radio station to request songs, and they were always requesting something from the latest album or something. I forgot to respond to your question previously about when I was in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. The Beatles' music spread to Japan, to Germany, to Sweden. In fact, they did a lot of their early days of rehearsing in Germany. So they were popular there first, actually. But anyway, it spread around the world. It was amazing how it brought kids together, no matter what their language, no matter what their political stance. It brought them together around the world. Mm-hmm. The hairstyle change and the songs themselves, other bands trying to mimic them and their style. But anyway, in Vietnam, of course, they had their music that appealed to them, that to GIs really wasn't what we wanted to hear. So a Vietnamese band would listen to a Beatles song and other rock and roll songs too, but they'd listen to a Beatles song over and over and over again until they could mimic the words. They didn't speak the English language, but they could mimic the words well enough, or where they would come on a weekend to perform in front of a few hundred GIs. They could sing a Beatles tune pretty well, and then we could feel it. You know, it brought us kind of home because it was something memorable to us from the 60s.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, for people who kind of are wondering, okay, Jennifer, why are you talking about neuroscience of music? There's a reason why it felt like home to you. There's a reason why you kind of felt that sense of connectedness and what have you through the music, because it can actually lower stress hormones and influence the feel-good chemicals of the brain. The same thing could be said years later when you were at the Paul McCartney concert and heard "Hey Jude." So I'm wondering if you could tell people about what you experienced. And this was probably maybe 15 years ago or something, when you were at a Paul McCartney concert, and just hearing "Hey Jude" and seeing people in the crowd and experiencing it yourself, just how it affected people.
It was a great experience. I used to tell my students that I hope in your life more than once you experience the joy of being with a large number of people and feeling proud. I would say maybe at a school event, maybe you go to a class play and you're so proud of your classmates and what they've done on stage. Especially you go to an athletic event and watch your school, you know, have a competitive game, and you feel in cheering you're part of something big. That's the same thing with the Beatles music. Kids felt, not everybody, some kids were country, some kids were of different total sound, but I would say the majority of kids related to their music, and not just the tunes, the lyrics. I heard Tom Hanks say one time when he was on Johnny Carson or something, that what young boy couldn't relate to "Oh Darlin'" when he had breakup with his girlfriend. He said he would sit and listen to that song over and over because it helped him bleed. It helped his heart open up and express an emotion of sorrow. And that's what their music, early music especially, did. And later on, that was one thing too, when you get that popular, be it Taylor Swift, Elvis, Frank Sinatra, whoever it might be, the Bee Gees, Michael Jackson, once you get an initial buy-in from kids, they accept you pretty much as you go on. They try to buy into you as you transition to more complicated music and sounds. That's what the Beatles were able to do as they matured as a band.
I could see that. Well, and I know I saw Paul McCartney in concert as well at Target Stadium or Target Field in Minneapolis. And it was a beautiful night, you know, nice warm air. You could see stars and stuff outside. And when they started playing "Hey Jude," all these people, like thousands of people in the stadium, got out their cell phones and they're just swaying. Now, of course, back in the day, it would have been cigarette lighters at concerts, but now thankfully we're past that. But all these cell phones are swaying, and by the light of their phones, I could see people with tears coming down their faces, and it was just uniting people. It was kind of like, regardless of who you were or where you were from, there were people who felt the physical benefits of nostalgia with that music, because maybe it reminded them of their first kiss or their first car or their first job or whatever it was that was actually positive. And I know that probably about a year or so ago on my podcast here, I interviewed someone who has a dance class for older people, like in senior living buildings and things like that. And a lot of the people who come to her class happen to have things such as Parkinson's disease or perhaps Alzheimer's or things like that. And there's actual science we talked about in that episode about how people who have Parkinson's disease are less apt to shake if they're dancing to music that has meaning for them, that has those memories of, you know, first kiss, what have you, all that jazz. Reason being, it's because that music is actually influencing your dopamine levels. It's that neurochemical that makes you feel good. So the increase in the dopamine makes them shake less. So it's just fascinating how that works. And it's also interesting to think about how the Beatles influenced other bands that you would never guess. So I know a couple of years ago, I watched an interview that Dan Rather did with Paul Stanley from Kiss. And when you think about Kiss, and you think about how when they were popular back in the 70s and 80s and going forward, just with their scary makeup and their scary boots and their studded everything, you would never guess that they would have been affected by the Beatles. but I've heard interviews with both Paul and with Gene Simmons about how the Beatles inspired them. And in one particular interview, this one with Dan Rather, Paul had shared how he was born with an ear that didn't quite develop the way that it's supposed to. Like the cartilage is kind of balled up. And so he was very self-conscious about it growing up because back then it was popular to have a very short haircut so kids could see it and would tease him. But the Beatles then made it more socially acceptable to have longer hair. So that gave him confidence by growing his hair out. And then who knew that years later, when more like rock music, heavy rock and metal became popular, that they had their own large, long hair. But yeah, the Beatles affected a lot of people and influenced people along the way. But interesting stuff.
When you think of the chain of connections, when music, and there's other things that can do it too, when music can inspire you as a person to sit alone and listen to a song and maybe bring tears to your eyes of joy, of sorrow. So it affects you one person at a time. Then it affects you, like you said, in a memory, maybe with another person. So there's a two-person connection. They hear that song 30 years later, reminds them of you. You hear it, reminds you of them. Then there's the friend, larger group connection. I remember my buddies and I would go to a basketball game, and I Feel Fine came on by the Beatles. And we had two guys illegally roll the back windows down, sit up on the edge of the door, pound on the roof. Well, the guys in front were pounding on the roof, and we were in beat with the music. It was just an adrenaline rush of 5 guys crammed into a car. Yep. Then you go into a larger group of watching a concert, like I said, coming out of just Paul McCartney, because at the time the Beatles some of them had passed away. And to be with total strangers, to be with a friend or a girlfriend's one thing, or your buddies or your classmates, but to be with 18,000 people in an arena, coming out singing Hey Jude and smiling at the guy next to you. Wouldn't that be great? And that's what Paul sang about, if we all gave peace a chance. If indeed people in our country could come together on something, if it's music or a political decision, or people of the world that could come together. In fact, you heard they had a song like that. Let's all give peace a chance. Let's have the world come together.
Yeah.
What a feeling to get 18,000 people feeling good, total strangers. What a feeling to get 1 million people. What a feeling to get multi-millions together feeling good about something.
Yes. No, I agree completely. And that was why I even have started the idea of, should I have a chapter on music in the book that I wrote? Because I thought, why is it that if I go to a Timberwolves game or a Vikings game or whatever it is, and all of a sudden I start hearing like "We Will Rock You," that drum chant, and people are now stomping their feet and clapping their hands. You now have thousands of people around the stadium, just getting into "We Will Rock You" and clapping, all that kind of stuff. Music can affect you physically. Or even now, the opening guitar riff, "Welcome to the Jungle" by Guns N' Roses, gets people going at athletic events as well. And it's a great way to unite people, and again, be positive, and kind of get you kind of in that moment, that those feelings of connectedness, go a long way. But it's also interesting how you could have the same song, but people have two totally different paradigms as far as like what they think of it and what it reminds them of. So, for example, when you think of "Twist and Shout," you might think of whether it's that car ride with people banging on the roof of the car, or maybe you think about going to the movie in Duluth about the Beatles or whatever. What I associate it with is back in the 1980s, the Ferris Bueller's Day Off movie, when Ferris Bueller is skipping school for the day. Not that I'm not advocating that, but I'm just saying that in the movie, he gets onto a parade float in downtown Chicago and starts lip syncing. He's going like this to "Twist and Shout," and you have all the guys with their brass instruments and like their tubas and trumpets and what have you going like this, and doing it to "Twist and Shout." And I did some research on that movie scene, and I found out that John Hughes, the guy who wrote Ferris Bueller's Day Off and who directed it, he purposely left in footage they got of not just the actors and the extras that came in. I mean, they had advertisements on radio stations in Chicago to get people to come to that place for the parade they had. But beyond that, they actually got footage of people who were just minding their own business, working that day, that happened to be caught on film, dancing to the music. So here they have Twist and Shout playing. You had construction workers wearing hard hats on scaffolding. There were guys washing windows, and they kept in that footage in the movie. People who were just dancing with strangers. Because you're right, it can unite people. It's pretty amazing. But
when you think of
yeah.
one of the major events in most people's lives is getting married. It's hard to imagine something. Again, they somewhat know each other, but there could be total strangers. But music is an important part of the ceremony.
Oh, yeah.
Interject. It isn't just Beatles music. I probably would have, in fact, I did have myself a Beatles song played, but music in general, yes, tend to make people in the mood of what is going on.
Oh, yeah. And it's also why when a DJ tries to decide what kind of a song list to have at a reception, they'll ask ahead of time, they'll ask the wedding party, what are the demographics like of the guests who are going to be here? Are there going to be baby boomers, Gen Xers, Gen Y, Gen Z? I mean, whatever. And that makes a difference in the kind of music they choose to play. So same thing for class reunions, because it could evoke, not just a good time as far as like current music, but also that nostalgia of the old stuff and thinking back to high school or college. It's pretty powerful. But
I used to tell people I chaperoned, I think, 225 dances from proms to Friday night, homecoming, spring dances, whatever. And after 30 some years of chaperoning dances, I would tell the DJs, I could give you a list of probably 15 songs that'll get most people out of their seats and onto the dance floor. And it went across from a wide spectrum of songs that do that. It just kind of electrifies people. Oh, I'll sit here and tell, wow, that song, I got to get up there and move. It stimulates you in that way.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I do have, I made a little quiz. It's just 3 questions. It's called Quiz for Dad for this podcast. And this is payback because back when I was in 3rd grade, you made me memorize my times tables. So yeah, maybe it was 4th grade. Yeah.
Just don't ask me the names of your cats. I won't.
Yeah, right. Why? I assume you already know that. So yeah, I'm not even going to ask.
They're tattooed on my arm, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So this first question is, do you know how the Beatles got their name?
It was actually from the Texas rock and roll guy, had black glasses. They were called the Crickets.
Oh,
the Crickets. What was his name? He played, in fact, one of his last concerts was here at the Duluth Arena.
Buddy Holly.
And they were to fly to North Dakota from there to Iowa, and their plane crashed. That's the day the music died. The song about that.
American Pie.
They were called the Crickets, and John and Paul, who started the Beatles, took off from that.
I read that online as well, and then I also read someplace else that a publicist of theirs had said it came from a Marlon Brando movie. Apparently there was a Marlon Brando movie where he was in a motorcycle gang and there was a rival motorcycle gang called the Beatles. So it could be either, who knows? But yeah, right. So there's different things online. And then do you know the name of the former drummer that the Beatles had before they became famous?
Yeah, my wife and I just watched a special on Netflix about Pete Best.
That's him.
A lawsuit he got some money for it because they had become pretty much famous and were doing a lot of packed concerts in England, and they decided for a variety of reasons they wanted to replace him. Yeah. They did replace him with Ringo, yes.
And speaking of Ringo, that's my last question. Do you know what his real name is?
Yeah, Richard Starkey.
You got it. Yep, that's it. So, yep.
So I get to hold the cat for an hour or what?
I was just going to say, if you're lucky, maybe the cats will hang out with you. Right. So I also wanted to touch base just on, the emotional grit that the Beatles had. I mean, they started out as kids. I mean, it's my understanding that Paul and John, when they met, were like 15 and 16 years old. I mean, really young, They all came from very humble means. John had dyslexia, but still managed to write song lyrics and do things. Ringo spent almost 2 years in a sanitarium because he was trying to heal from tuberculosis, and that's where he learned how to play the drums. I mean, he played in a hospital band, just these very humble means. As you alluded to earlier, they performed in Germany before coming here. And from what I read, when they were performing in Germany, they all slept on bunk beds in a storage room behind a theater. And they were just grateful to get the gigs. It just was what it was. So on that same note, I did some research because I had heard that when Paul McCartney was on 60 Minutes, this was either called out or he himself had just admitted that none of them could read sheet music.
Right.
And I thought that's fascinating. They still pursued their passion even though they can't read the notes. And I wondered what other musicians are like that, like famous people that made it big that they can't read sheet music. And I found out that it's a little bit more common than people might think. But the way people have gotten around it to still pursue their passion, to me, is where the grit comes in. So, for example, with the Beatles, Paul McCartney said that the fact that they all got together to write their music, that they, as long as they understood what chords to play and how the melody was supposed to sound, they didn't feel the need to write it down. So obviously somebody else did. But yeah, you'd have to memorize it and make sure that you could do your part. Also,
how about this bit of trivia? It was interesting in a special. Paul was saying that he and John sometimes would skip school when they were 15, 16, and they were both motivated, the grit, to keep pushing. They wanted to be at the top of the charts, which took years to do, to perfect their trade. Yeah. He said they would go in his bathroom and they sang this song they wrote called She Loves You. And Paul's dad was a musician. That's how Paul got his start, and modeling from his dad. So they sang She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah. And the dad says, sounds great, boys, but shouldn't it be yes, yes, yes?
Oh, that's funny, really?
And John and Paul laughed and shook their head no. Now that simple little thing, I was wondering, would the music have appealed if they were just totally grammatically perfect? She loves you, yes, yes, yes. I guess I've heard it 1,000 times, yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the oohs they got from Little Richard because they were playing backup in his concerts in England. And he kind of got them going with that high pitch, the ooh sound with their voices, which again added to the stimulus of kids. Something different.
Oh, definitely. Yes, for sure. Yeah, it's cool to think about people who preceded them, whether it be Chuck Berry, Little Richard, all that kind of stuff, as far as like things they brought to the table, bluesy kind of stuff that had an influence, as far as with rock and roll as well. And speaking of having a blues influence, this is a good segue for the Rolling Stones. Mm-hmm. So, I live in Edina, so I'm telling that so the listeners know, which is a suburb of Minneapolis. And probably about maybe 20 minutes from me is a small town called Excelsior. It's a small town on Lake Minnetonka. And there's a legend in Excelsior that one of their former residents, who has since passed away, named Mr. Jimmy, is the person who inspired the whole "you can't always get what you want," that the lyric that Mick wrote. And that stems from a concert that the Rolling Stones played in Excelsior in a ballroom at the former amusement park that used to be there back in the early 60s. It was actually in 1964, the same year as this Ed Sullivan show with the Beatles. But the Rolling Stones were new. People didn't quite know what to think of them yet. They weren't popular yet. They played to maybe 200 or 300 people, so it was a very small crowd. But legend has it, the day after the concert in Excelsior, Mick went to a drugstore to get a prescription, and apparently he recognized Mr. Jimmy from the concert. And apparently Mr. Jimmy was kind of disillusioned because he wanted to get, I believe it was a cherry Coke, and could only get like a regular Coke. And he was talking to Mick about it, and he goes, well, you can't always get what you want. Well, now in the song, it mentions Mr. Jimmy and it mentions the Coke and what have you. So if people Google Mr. Jimmy Excelsior, Minnesota, you'll see different news stories come up about it. And there's a restaurant in Excelsior that's called Maynard's, and on their menu you can get a Mr. Jimmy sandwich. So yeah, it's pretty cool how that still plays a role decades later, and people want to be a part of that. So pretty cool stuff. But circling back to artists who you might think are like phenomenal musicians, of course, in their own right, but how they got around not reading sheet music. So on my list here, I have Eric Clapton is one of those people. I mean, phenomenal guitarist, but he learned to play the guitar by listening to blues music repeatedly until he could actually match on his guitar the sounds he was hearing by listening to the band that was playing the respective song. So he forced himself to have the discipline and the drive, again, to pursue his passion and hone his craft and do it without reading the sheet music.
I guess the word you call it is grit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Michael Jackson. I mean, he obviously has been an entertainer or was an entertainer slash singer since he was little, but he couldn't read sheet music. And so, from what I read here, he would learn to just sing what he thought was appropriate, whether it was for the percussion or a guitar or what have you. And by doing that, it helped him kind of enrich, the way that he would sing, just on top of the instruments. But yeah, couldn't read sheet music. And by the way, speaking of grit, guess how old he was when the album Thriller came out?
I would say in his 30s.
He was 24.
Wow.
24. Yeah. So
Musical
again,
genius. Yeah. Musical
that
genius.
discipline. Yeah, the discipline, the drive, I mean, there was no YouTube back then. You know what I mean? So it was people had to go to clubs and hope to get discovered and get on TV shows, and it would take years.
He and Paul teamed up and had a couple of hit songs. They worked together well.
I remember that. Wasn't one of them Say, 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 I think? I forget the other one, but
one about getting along. It was the black and white keys of a piano, and how the black and white keys of the piano get along and make good music, as people, black and white people, should get along.
Cool.
And have a good life.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, two geniuses together. It was really.
Oh
something.
Yeah. And then speaking of geniuses, Jimi Hendrix was self-taught. He learned to play the guitar by ear. So again, he wasn't going to not do it, just figured out the how. And then Prince, oh my word, Prince. So Paisley Park is maybe a half hour from where I live, and I've toured it a couple times, and I saw him perform there a couple times. Phenomenal artist. But he learned how to play 27 instruments. I mean, amazing. And yes, and from what I've read, didn't read sheet music. And guess how old he was when Purple Rain was released?
I think he was under 21.
When it came out, he was 25. So he may have written it when he was 21. But yeah, the movie and the album, 25. So there's a lot to be said. I mean, people can't use age to try to stunt their pursuing their passions. It might take longer, but if you're motivated, it's interesting whether you're from the Beatles or whether you're someone like Michael Jackson or Prince. Pretty cool stuff. But any kind of anecdotal stories in reference to Beatlemania or things, or just the kind of that whole genre of music back in the 60s that you want to call out as we kind of close things up?
When I saw in my teaching career, the Beatles would come in waves. And like when I'd chaperone decorating for the prom or something, and the kids would bring out their boom boxes, they'd get some rock and roll, but about every 5 years, there'd be a big wave of guys, it seemed like, especially, would play Beatles music. They really had 20 years after they were popular, they still buy into it. Cool. And to think that when everybody is on Earth that's here now, 5 billion people, let's say in 150 years, let's make it 200 years, we're all gone. To think that the music made by some artist, and I believe the Beatles will be one of them, will still be played 200 years from now. As we listen to Mozart, as we listen to Beethoven, they're long gone. And yet what they did was such a genius thing for their day, especially with the limited instrumentation they had, to think that we still appreciate what they did and can relate to it. And I really feel, whether it's in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's always an audience. And it's another interesting thing too. Once you tied into it, whether it be Taylor Swift or Michael Jackson, whoever, Elvis, it's like a lifetime commitment. I will always like Beatles music. I will always like the Beatles themselves because I attached to them when I was young, and that attachment will always be there. Not like I listen to them anymore every day. I don't. But when I do hear it, yes, like you were saying before, it attaches the things in your memory of days gone by.
Oh, yeah. And I'm trying to think, which Beatles song is it that you have as your voicemail greeting on your phone, on your cell phone?
Yeah. I have to, since I don't call it.
Yeah, the lyrics are like, you say goodbye and I say hello.
I say hello, hello, hello. I don't know why you say goodbye, I say hello.
Yes.
That has been for years. That's my my tone on my answering machine.
That's awesome. Well, and didn't you also used to use music? I think it may have even been like the theme for Rocky movies to try to incentivize or motivate kids when taking your math tests.
That's another whole topic that I think whenever I go to a movie, it can be a great movie, but I say the one thing lacking was a good theme song. I mean, who can't hear the introductory music to a James Bond movie and not think James Bond.
Right, right.
And then throughout the movie, they play that James Bond theme. Frozen, the movie from Disney or Pixar. The music from it was very pop. Titanic, with Celine Dion singing.
Yeah.
So yeah, movies also. Yeah, the music connection to the movies. So anyway, I used to play before a math test for a while, just for something different. I didn't do it throughout the whole year. I'd play the Rocky theme. I'd tell the kids, okay, now tomorrow we got a big test coming up. We got to get psyched up for it. When you come in, as I'm passing the test out, I'm going to play the Rocky theme. And that was 15, 20 years after the movie. And the kids would actually say, I got to wind down, because they'd da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So they'd be all excited, and they get their pencils out and their papers. And I'd look at them, and they'd smile, and they'd put their head down, and finally they'd relax and get into the math mode, after the music riled them up.
That's what I'm saying.
Band. Your pep band. What's a pep band for? To get the crowd moving with the team.
So you helped lower their stress hormones. I'm telling you, if you think about it back then, you couldn't just probably, and like was the World Wide Web even a thing back when you did that? Like, could you Google stuff when you did that?
I just had a CD. I'd play it on a cheap recorder in front of class. Yeah.
So, and by the way, people sometimes wonder, well, Jen, why do you say World Wide Web? Why not just say internet? The reason why I say World Wide Web is because the internet did exist back in the 60s, but it was being used by government researchers. The public didn't have access to it yet. But the World Wide Web came about, I think maybe in like 1993, I think, when the actual general public could start looking up stuff. So you at least had the foresight to play the Rocky CD, not knowing the science behind it, but you just knew that it somehow it made kids smile. Somehow it made them, there was science behind what you did. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Good stuff. But it's also worth noting that, as you and I talked about a little bit before the interview, that NASA put a spacecraft, into outer space with the thought that if there is some kind of life out there outside of ours here, that they wanted to have certain things emitting from that spacecraft, and whether it be music from different countries. Did you say there's also like math equations and different things on there as well?
There were 5 major categories. Carl Sagan at the time, 1977, said we have to try to reach out beyond our solar system, beyond Pluto. Mm-hmm. And so they decided to get the money from NASA, and they put Voyager 1, and then 2 years later, I believe, or 3 years later, they put Voyager 2 out. And on each one, they had 5 major categories, one of which, etched in gold, so it would, I guess, always be there, was a map of our solar system. So if anybody saw it or it landed somewhere, they can kind of maybe figure out where we were. So one was that. And then secondly, they tried to put scientific equations to show our level of intelligence. So they had the math sine curve on there, and they had some other physics equations from Newton. And sounds. They put the sounds of animals, like a whale. Mm-hmm. Sounds of a babbling brook. There's about 40 sounds that they put, a volcano exploding. And then one of the categories was music. And they go from music from, they believe it was like 6,000 years ago, to Beethoven, to Mozart, to India, music from India, all kinds of cross-cultural music, showing that we were culturally advanced, trying to inspire whoever might see this. Phenomenally, it's going to take 40,000 years for that, beyond, once it left our solar system, to go into another solar system. Imagine 40,000 years. Now, we're going to lose contact with it in 2035. It takes 75 seconds for a picture or a signal to come back. And then beyond that, we aren't going to be able to stay in tune with it anymore. But it'll keep traveling. And there's so much space in outer space, there's no fear of it hitting something even. It's just remarkable. Wow. So, yeah, when you think that music is one of the things we communicate with other worlds with, besides with people on this planet.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yes.
Well, and NASA also uses music to help astronauts. I mean, as far as trying to motivate them and get them kind of like, well, part of it's feeling connected with people down here, but also part of it's to motivate them. And then surgeons listen to music during surgeries. I mean, it all depends on whatever kind of music they like, but it could be anything from rock music to hip hop to like Beatles kind of genre or Rolling Stones, whatever. But Yeah, it can definitely motivate you, regardless of what you do or where you're from.
It's one of the
But
things we talked about with the students about good study habits, being able to at home find a quiet place. And some kids would tell me that they can't be in a totally quiet place and study. They have to
mm,
have some background music,
mm,
and pros and cons to that. Some kids have to go to sleep with music because they can get their mind into that rather than the worries of the day, which is one of the
yeah,
purposes of music, to try to get your mind off of everyday stresses and into a world of hopefully joy and also stress release. Like I said before, the Beatles songs, "Oh Darling," where you're moaning about a lost loved one.
yeah. Well, I personally listened to music when I had my MRIs, and it was thankfully the hospital let me bring my smartphone, with me to each of my appointments and for my radiation treatments as well. And on my list of music, again, it was hair bands or hip hop because that's my thing, either or. But the radiologist later told me that whenever she would walk by the radiation room, she's like, "Yeah, Jennifer Fernjack must be here," because she would hear either hair bands or hip hop from. But it took my mind. I mean, have you ever heard of that term called highway hypnosis?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So for the listeners, highway hypnosis is something where, say you're driving home from work. It's some kind of a familiar drive. You get home and you're like, yeah, I have no idea how I got here because your mind was elsewhere. That's what my nurse in the radiation room equated to what I experienced with music during my radiation treatments. Because one time in particular, I was listening to a song and all of a sudden the radiation machine turned off. And for a split second, I was disappointed because I wanted to finish my song. It's like my mind forgot where I was. I was so into the music that I forgot that I was getting radiation beams on my head. Which for listeners who don't know, I didn't have cancer, but because my tumor is partially encasing the carotid artery, what the surgeon couldn't get out, the remaining cells got the radiation treatments with the thought of killing them. So, and that
I
was
just
back in 2016.
I just thought of this example too. I don't know how old this form of music would be, but think of Native Americans with their chants. So the
Mhm.
words weren't as meaningful, as far as I know, as the drumming. And
Yeah.
the drumming I heard related to the beat of the heart. The
Mm.
drummer picks up that beat, and that's somewhat what people relate to, as they have that body rhythm. And then the Native American dances around the campfire, be it an entertainment dance, I don't know, or
I can see
something
that.
more aggressive. They're going to get involved in something and it got them worked up, or got everybody feeling on the same wavelength
Yeah.
when you dance to that drummer.
I could see that. There are also studies that show that by playing lullabies or singing lullabies in neonatal units, it can help with the development of immature babies or premature babies, excuse me. So yeah, really cool. But well, we're gonna go ahead and close things up here. So thank you so much for listening today, and thank you, Dad, for being a part of this podcast. I appreciate the opportunity to hear about how you experienced Beatlemania. So much appreciated.
Well, it's a
And
rainy day tomorrow, so maybe I'll pull out some of my old albums and CDs, and I'll play some of my old favorite tunes, Beatles
cool,
songs especially. Yes.
nice. All right. And for those of you who are listening, again, please feel free to go to my YouTube channel at Emotional Grit to watch this episode and other episodes as well. And feel free to like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, everyone.